The day began like a held breath. The sky, pale and stretched thin, carried the smell of dust and distance. A woman walked along the empty road that wound between the dry hills, her skirts dragging through the powdery soil like a memory that refused to fade. Her name was Mary Ellen Granger, and she carried 3 small boys and one great burden, to begin again in a world that had long forgotten mercy. Her shoes were nearly gone, patched with bits of cloth. The hem of her dress had turned the color of the road. Still, she walked upright, steady, each step carrying the sound of quiet defiance. Behind her came her sons, Caleb, 12, thin-shouldered but proud, Luke, 9, watchful and still, and Thomas, 6, all soft curls and stubborn hope. They had left the last town 2 days ago. The people there had looked at them with eyes that said, "Not our problem." Mary Ellen had learned that charity wore out faster than a pair of shoes. So now, the road was their home again, a line of dust, a horizon that never came closer by midday. The sun pressed against them like a judgment. The boys' faces were flushed, their lips cracked. They hadn't eaten since dawn, only shared the last piece of cornbread in silence. Mary Ellen's throat ached, but she kept humming, a tune her husband once sang when life was kind and the fields were green. The song caught in her chest when she thought of him, Evan Granger. The fever had taken him the winter before, leaving behind a name stained by another man's lies and debts. The house was gone, the mules sold, the papers stamped with red ink that said property reclaimed, but no ink could erase a man's worth. She told her boys that every night. "You come from good," she'd whisper beside the campfire. "Don't let anyone take that from you." When the sun began to fall, a smudge of a town appeared ahead, Red Hollow. They called it on the maps, though it looked more like a handful of roofs scattered across tired land. Smoke rose from chimneys, the faint clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoing against the hills. Civilization. Or at least, the shadow of it. Her legs trembled as she led the boys in. The main street was narrow, lined with wooden storefronts and horses hitched in front of a saloon. Men leaned on posts, watching her pass. Some tipped their hats politely, others didn't bother. Women turned their faces away, whispering behind gloved hands. Mary Ellen tried the general store first. The man behind the counter wouldn't meet her eyes. "Work?" she asked softly. "I can cook, mend, clean." He wiped the counter with a rag, muttered something about not needing help, and nodded toward the door. She tried 2 more places, then a small bakery near the end of the street. A woman came out, face sharp and clean as bone. She looked Mary Ellen up and down, then tossed her a day-old loaf. "For the little ones," she said, her tone somewhere between pity and dismissal. Mary Ellen caught the bread, whispered thanks, and stepped away before the woman could change her mind by the time night began to fall. She'd run out of doors to knock on. The boys sat on the edge of the old post office porch, their heads drooping with exhaustion. She tore the bread into 4 pieces, saving the smallest for herself. They ate without words. Caleb leaned against her shoulder, his voice rough from the road. "Mama, are we going to find a place this time?" She smoothed his hair, watching the sun sink behind the hills. "We'll find something," she said. It wasn't the truth, not yet, but it was enough to make him close his eyes and rest. The streets emptied as the sky turned copper and blue. Lamps flickered in the windows. A wind picked up, carrying the smell of sage and smoke. Mary Ellen pulled her shawl tighter, her thoughts as heavy as her limbs. She was thinking of where to sleep when she heard the sound, slow hoofbeats against the road, steady as a heartbeat. A horse stopped a few feet away. The man who dismounted was tall, broad-shouldered, with a quietness that seemed to settle the dust around him. His hat shadowed his eyes, but she could tell they were watchful, not cruel. His coat was plain, worn from work rather than vanity. He looked at her, then at the boys. No questions, no pity, just the measured silence of someone used to carrying his own ghosts. After a long moment, he said simply, "You and the children eaten?" She hesitated, words caught in her throat. Finally, she shook her head. He nodded once, as if that decided everything. "There's food at my place," he said. "Biscuits and beans. Won't win prizes, but it's hot." She glanced at her sons, at the way Thomas's small hands clutched his stick, at Luke's hollow eyes, at Caleb trying to sit taller than his weariness allowed. Pride whispered, "Say no," but love said, "Say yes." So she rose, gathering her shawl around her. "We'll come," she said softly. The man turned his horse and started toward the hills. The lantern he carried swung in rhythm with his steps, throwing a soft circle of light ahead. Mary Ellen followed, her boys close behind. As they climbed the slope out of town, the world grew quiet again, just wind, crickets, and the whisper of boots on dirt. When they reached the ridge, the valley opened wide below, silvered by moonlight. There, on a stretch of land bordered by fences and oak, stood a ranch house. Light glowed in the windows, warm and steady. Smoke curled from the chimney. The man led his horse to the barn and held the door open. "You'll sleep easy tonight," he said simply. Mary Ellen stood there for a long moment, her sons at her side, staring at that doorway glowing like the promise of a new life. She stepped forward, the boards creaked beneath her feet. The air smelled of hay and wood smoke. For the first time in months, she felt the weight on her chest ease just enough to let her breathe. Behind her, the wind carried off the dust of the road. Ahead of her, a stranger's kindness waited, quiet, steady, and real. And though she didn't yet know his name, something in her heart whispered that she had just met the man who would give her sons back theirs. Morning light spilled across the valley like gold dust, soft and forgiving. The Cutter Ranch stirred awake to the low hum of cattle and the sound of boots on wooden floors. Inside the modest house that sat at the center of it all, Mary Ellen moved quietly, her hands already busy before the rooster crowed. She had been there only a week, yet it felt longer, not because of comfort, but because silence had its own rhythm here. James Cutter, the man who had taken her and her sons in, spoke little. He wasn't unkind, just deliberate. He seemed to measure every word before it left his mouth, as if the world might waste it otherwise. Mary Ellen had learned to read that silence. It wasn't the sharp, uneasy quiet of pity or judgment. It was the kind that gave a person space to breathe, to mend the parts of themselves they hadn't yet dared to look at. The boys had begun to bloom in that quiet too. Caleb helped the ranch hands with the horses, trying hard to prove he belonged among men. Luke followed the cook, Nora, through the kitchen, curious about every scent and pot. And little Thomas shadowed James everywhere he went, from the barn to the pasture, his small boots leaving ghost prints beside the rancher's heavy steps. James pretended not to notice the boy's devotion, but when he thought no one was watching, he'd slow his pace so Thomas could keep up. In the evenings, Mary Ellen sat by the window, sewing or mending, the lamplight painting her hands gold. The house, once hollow and quiet, now carried the soft pulse of life again. The sound of laughter, the squeak of floorboards, the smell of stewed. It didn't take long for the town to notice. Red Hollow had long memories and short grace. Whispers traveled faster than the wind that cut across the plains. Folks at the saloon muttered about the widow on the Cutter place. How quick she'd found herself under a roof again. How convenient her timing had been. Some called her desperate. Others called her dangerous in the quiet way women are when they survive too much. James ignored it. He always had. But when one man's mouth grew bold one evening, James's stare silenced the entire room. He didn't raise his voice, didn't lift a hand. He simply looked at the man long enough to make him wish he hadn't spoken. Mary Ellen never heard about it, but she sensed it in the way James's eyes lingered a little longer when she passed him the coffee the next morning. The days stretched into weeks. She found a rhythm in the work. Her hands grew stronger again, not the fragile kind of strength born of fear, but the grounded sort that comes from purpose. When she hung the laundry under the open sky, she would catch herself watching the hills, the way the wind moved through the grass like the tide. The land was beginning to speak to her, low and steady. Sometimes she'd catch James out there too, standing on the ridge at dusk, his figure cut against the dying sun. He'd stay until the last light faded, then walk back slowly, like a man remembering something he'd once lost. One evening, when the day's work was done and the sky burned orange, she found him fixing the fence near the western pasture. The boards creaked under his hammer. She approached quietly, holding a basket of nails. "You missed supper," she said softly. He paused, glancing up. The brim of his hat shadowed his face, but she could see the faint curve of a smile. "I'll eat after," he said. She set the basket down beside him. "You shouldn't work in the dark." His eyes flicked toward the horizon. "The dark don't scare me." Something in his tone, quiet, honest, made her chest tighten. It used to scare me, she said, almost to herself. He looked at her then, really looked, as though trying to see the story behind her voice. But he didn't pry. He just nodded once, as if to say he understood. The wind rose, carrying the scent of rain. They stood there a moment longer, both waiting, both unsure what they were waiting for. Then the first drops began to fall, soft, warm, cleansing. She laughed quietly and turned toward the house. Behind her, James watched her go, the faintest trace of something like peace on his weathered face. In the following days, the rain broke the dry spell. The grass grew greener, the air softer. The boys ran through puddles, chasing each other's reflections. For the first time, laughter filled the ranch, not the forced kind, but real, untamed, childlike joy. Old Ben, the ranch hand with a beard like wild sage, shook his head with a grin. "Feels like this place remembered it's alive," he said to Nora. The older woman smiled knowingly. "Sometimes it takes a woman's heart to remind the earth how to breathe." By early autumn, the Granger boys had become a part of the land. Caleb rode a horse with confidence. Luke helped Ben fix saddles. Thomas, small as he was, had learned to whistle to the chickens, convinced they listened. Mary Ellen would watch them from the porch, her heart swelling and aching all at once. She still carried grief like a shadow, but it no longer led her. It followed now, quiet, smaller than before. One evening, she sat with James on the porch. The air was cool, the world painted silver under the moon. The boys had gone to bed, their laughter fading into dreams. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was warm, alive, filled with all the things they didn't need to say. Finally, she whispered, "You've given them something I couldn't." James turned his head slightly. "What's that?" She looked toward the window, where the faint shadows of her sons moved against the lamplight. "A chance to belong." He nodded, his gaze softening. "Everyone deserves that." They sat together a while longer, listening to the steady breath of the night, the crickets, the slow wind, the crackle of the lantern flame. Somewhere deep inside that calm, something unspoken began to grow between them. Not love yet, but the quiet recognition of two souls that had found peace in each other's company. Before the night ended, Mary Ellen looked up at the stars and thought of her husband's name, Granger. She had once feared it would die with him, buried under debt and shame. But here, on this ranch that listened to silence and kindness, she began to believe that names, like hearts, could be rebuilt. And though neither of them said it aloud, both James Cutter and Mary Ellen Granger knew something had shifted in the air that night. Something gentle, steady, and unbreakable had begun. The sky over Red Hollow was pale and uneasy that morning. A gray sheet stretched thin over the hills. The wind carried dust from far-off trails, whispering of strangers on the move. James Cutter felt it before he saw it. He always did. Years of quiet had sharpened his senses more than battle ever had. He was mending a saddle out by the corral when the horizon began to move. 3 riders, maybe 4, coming fast. He watched them with a stillness that made even the horses uneasy. The dust behind them rose like a warning. Inside the house, Mary Ellen was kneading bread. The boys were laughing in the next room, Thomas humming one of Nora's songs off-key. When she caught sight of James through the window, standing stiff as a fence post, she knew. Something in his posture, shoulders drawn tight, hat brim low, told her the peace they'd found had just been borrowed time. By the time the riders reached the gate, the air had gone cold. They were drifters by the look of them, clothes sun-faded, faces rough with days of travel. But one of them dismounted with a familiarity that froze Mary Ellen where she stood. He was tall, lean, with a beard that hadn't been there before and eyes she'd once known better than her own reflection. "Elias," she breathed, her husband, or rather, the man she had buried in her heart 3 years ago, when word came that his wagon train had been ambushed and burned outside Santa Fe. The sound of his name reached the porch, where James now stood, still, unshaken, but watchful. Elias's gaze met Mary Ellen's, and in that single look the years unraveled. The grief, the hunger, the long nights of praying for a man who never came home. All of it returned like a flood. Her hands trembled against her apron. He took a slow step forward. "You're alive," she whispered. "I could say the same," he replied, his voice rough with miles and ghosts. "I came back, Mary. I came back for you and the boys." Behind her, Caleb and Luke had come to the doorway, confusion and hope tangled in their young faces. "Pa?" Luke said, the word breaking like something fragile. Elias smiled, weary but proud. "Yes, son. It's me." James Cutter didn't move. He simply watched, eyes narrowing slightly as the wind tugged at his coat. He'd seen men come back from the dead before. Some were worth welcoming. Some were worth warning. For the rest of that day, the Cutter Ranch held its breath. Elias was alive, half-starved, scarred, and changed in ways no one could measure. He told his story over supper, how he'd been captured by a gang that sold men into labor in the New Mexico mines, how he'd escaped, how every step home was a prayer. Mary Ellen listened, her mind a storm. She believed him, at least most of him. The scars, the hollowed eyes, the weight in his voice. But something in his manner had turned colder, darker. He carried not just survival, but bitterness, the kind that doesn't leave quietly. James said little through it all. He sat at the edge of the lamplight, silent, steady, letting Elias's words fall like stones into water. That night, when the boys slept, Mary Ellen stood on the porch again. The air was sharp with autumn. James joined her after a long while, his boots soft on the wood. "He's your husband," James said finally, not accusing, just stating a truth neither could ignore. She nodded, her throat tight. "I buried him in my heart, James. I built something else here. Something steady." He looked out toward the pasture, his jaw set. "Then you'll have to decide which life you mean to keep." The days that followed blurred into unease. Elias stayed, restless and brooding. He tried to take to ranch life, but the land didn't trust him the way it trusted James. The cattle spooked around him, and even the dogs kept their distance. He didn't miss James's quiet authority, either. One evening he spat in the dirt and said, "Funny how another man's shadow fits where mine used to be." James met his gaze, calm as a mountain. "You've been gone a long time." The world moved on. So did they. Tension hung between them like thunder waiting to break. Mary Ellen tried to keep peace, for the boys, for the home that had given them back their laughter. But she saw it coming. The past never returns without wanting something in exchange. Then came the morning Elias found the deed papers in James's desk, Cutter Ranch, listed under one name only. He confronted Mary Ellen in the kitchen, the paper shaking in his hand. "So this is it," he said, voice low but sharp. "You buried me and built a new life before the dirt on my grave went cold." She stood her ground. "I survived. That's what you taught me to do." His eyes softened for a moment, then hardened again. "And him? Did he save you out of kindness, or something else?" Before she could answer, the door opened. James stood there, silent but ready. Elias turned toward him, fury in his chest. "You took my place," Elias said. "My home, my family." James shook his head. "I didn't take what wasn't offered." The air was still, the kind of stillness that happens before lightning. Then Elias moved first, not with a gun, but with words that cut deep. "You'll never be their father." James's voice was steady. "No, but I never tried to be." Outside, a horse neighed, startled. Inside, Mary Ellen's tears broke the silence. "Stop," she said, her voice trembling but strong. "Both of you. I won't lose this peace, not again." For a long time, neither man spoke. Finally, Elias looked at her, really looked, and what he saw broke him more than any wound. The woman before him wasn't his anymore. She had weathered loss, grief, and mercy, and come out changed. He turned and walked toward the door. "Maybe the dead ought to stay dead," he murmured. When he rode out that evening, the sky burned with the last light of day. The boys watched from the porch, their faces pale and quiet. Mary Ellen stood beside them, her heart heavy but certain. James didn't say a word. He just tipped his hat low and went back to work. Later that night, after the stars came out, Mary Ellen stepped outside once more. The ranch was still, the kind of silence that feels earned. She looked toward the dark horizon where Elias had disappeared and whispered, "Goodbye." Behind her, the house glowed with lamplight. Her boys slept safe inside. The man who had saved them worked quietly in the barn, the steady rhythm of his hammer echoing through the night. The past had come, tested them, and ridden away. And what remained, this life, this peace, this fragile beginning, was theirs to keep. Winter came softly that year, slow and pale, like the land itself was tired of fighting. The mountains wore their crowns of snow, and the plains turned silver under frost. At Cutter Ranch, smoke curled from the chimney each dawn, thin and steady, a sign that life still burned within. The days since Elias rode away had been quiet. Too quiet at first, the kind of silence that trembles before it heals. But slowly, the rhythm of living returned. The boys began to laugh again, real laughter this time, not the kind built on pretending everything was fine. Mary Ellen felt it too, the warmth finding its way back into her bones, the fear loosening its hold. She would see James every morning at the barn, sleeves rolled, breath misting in the chill. There was no need for words between them. The way he glanced at her, a small nod, said more than any sentence could. She'd bring him coffee sometimes, black and strong, and they'd stand in that golden stillness where gratitude lived without sound. One afternoon, a week before Christmas, Thomas found something buried beneath the old cottonwood tree, a rusted tin box. Inside it was a folded piece of paper, yellowed and soft at the edges. It was the family Bible's missing page, the one that held the names. His grandfather's handwriting curled across it, faded but proud. Mary Ellen traced the letters slowly. Elias Macready, it read. And below that, blank lines meant for his sons' names, never filled in, because he was gone before any of them were born. For a long moment, she couldn't breathe. The paper felt like both a wound and a promise. When she showed it to James, he looked at it a while, thumb brushing the brittle edge. Then he said, "Maybe it's time those lines get written in." That night, they gathered around the table, the same table where silence had once lived like an uninvited guest. The lamp threw warm light across their faces. Mary Ellen took a pen and dipped it in ink that had long gone dry, but still managed to stain the page. Thomas first, then Caleb, then Luke. Their names joined their fathers, not as a shadow, but as something carried forward. When she finished, she paused, the air thick with meaning, then drew one final line beneath it. And under his care, they became whole again. She looked up at James. His eyes softened, a look of quiet pride, the kind a man wears when something deep and right has just been set in place. The next morning, word came from the sheriff's office in town. Elias Macready's body had been found miles south, near the river bend. His horse had returned alone days ago. They said it looked like an accident, the kind that happens when a man rides too far with too much on his mind. Mary Ellen stood at the gate for a long while after hearing it, her hands gripping the wood rail. The wind blew gentle, lifting the edge of her shawl. James didn't try to speak. He just stood beside her. "Do you think he found peace?" she asked finally, her voice barely a whisper. James looked toward the horizon. "Maybe he found what he was chasing," he said. "Sometimes that's enough." A few days later, she buried what was left of Elias under the cottonwood, the same tree where the tin box had waited all those years. The boys placed small stones beside the grave, and Thomas, trembling a little, read the Lord's Prayer from memory. When they were done, Mary Ellen laid the Bible page inside a small wooden frame and placed it on the mantel, not as a reminder of loss, but of lineage, of endurance. The ranch changed after that, though not in loud ways. It became lighter, as if the ghosts had finally given their blessing and moved on. The land responded too, calves born strong, wheat growing thick in the spring. Sometimes, when dusk came and the sky turned the color of old whiskey, James would sit with the boys on the porch and teach them how to carve whistles from willow twigs. His hands were rough, patient, sure. They called him Mr. Cutter at first, out of respect. But one evening, as the sun sank low, Luke, the youngest, said it differently. "Pa," he whispered without thinking, carving knife trembling in his hand. The word hung there, uncertain. James froze, then smiled, small and slow. "I reckon that'll do," he said. From that night on, the house carried two names, one written in the Bible, and one spoken with love as spring came again. Mary Ellen began to notice how the world seemed new in small ways. The walls of the house didn't echo anymore. The old fear had been replaced by something simpler, peace that came from having survived the storm. She'd walk the fields sometimes, skirts brushing through the grass, and think about all that had been lost and all that had been found. Life had not given her comfort easily, but it had given her meaning, and a name worth carrying forward. One evening, as the sun poured itself over the plains, she and James stood by the fence, watching the boys race the wind on horseback. Their laughter rolled across the land like music. Funny, she said softly. How something broken can grow stronger after it's mended. James nodded. That's what names are for, he said. They remember where we've been and remind us we're still here. The light faded slow, leaving a quiet that felt more like prayer than silence. The house behind them glowed faintly in the dark, steady as a heartbeat. Mary Ellen leaned into him just slightly, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel like a woman surviving. She felt like one who had lived. Out there, where the horizon kissed the fading light, a new legacy began, one built not on blood, but on mercy.